because there's absolutely no question. Of course, there's a wonderful Arab proverb which says, "He who speaks about the future lies, even when he tells the truth." We will get surprises, right? No question. But in one area, there'll be absolutely no surprise. There is no question whatsoever that the US-China geopolitical contest will accelerate over the next 10 years because there's a rock-solid consensus in Washington, D.C. that the United States has about 10 years to try and stop China from becoming number one. Because there's a fairly reasonable calculation that if the Chinese economy continues to grow, and if it becomes number one, then the world changes. So in some ways, you could argue it's rational on their part to try and stop China. Although I would also argue that the means they're using are irrational. So the contest will definitely accelerate. But you also ask, will it lead to war? And here, on balance, I'm reasonably optimistic that there will be no all-out war, because in an all-out war between two nuclear powers, there is no winner and a loser. There's a loser and a loser. Mm-hmm. So there will be an effort on both sides to try and avoid an outright war. But of course, the one lesson of history is that mistakes do happen. And that's what we need to worry about. Now, in terms of what we in East Asia can do about it, I think it's important for East Asia to keep up its culture of pragmatism that we have developed. One of the most unusual things that's happened in our region is that at the end of World War II, virtually all the major wars were fought here in East Asia. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Sino-Vietnamese War. But after the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, right, for the past 45 years,
no major war.
There's been no major war. This did not happen by accident. This happened as a result of decisions made by countries and leaders here who understood that the priority is to focus on economic development and not get engaged in wars. So therefore what we in East, I can tell you, if you look at my book, Can Asians Think? I quote several Western scholars who said at the end of the Cold War, Asia's future is Europe's past. So in the past, Europe fought all the big wars, World War I, World War II. Oh, that's Asia's future. Paradoxically, the opposite has happened. The major wars have happened on the fringes of Europe and not in Asia. And no European asked the most basic question, why have we Europeans not learned to be as peaceful as the Asians? In the case of China, I would say that China has got to calculate whether or not time is on China's side or not on China's side. If China's growth has peaked, right, as many Western scholars believe, and they may be right, never know, you'll find out 10 years from now, then I would say it's a problem for China, right? If your power has peaked, then your influence will diminish over the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe you want to try and achieve as much as you can. But if you don't believe that China has peaked, and you believe that China can grow at even 4 to 5% over the next 10 to 15 years, then China will eventually become the number one. So if time is on your side, you can be even more patient, even more restrained. So even though others, may be making stupid, nasty statements. I give you an example. For the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, to talk about expanding NATO in Asia is absurd. What what can we Asians learn from NATO, which has failed to achieve peace, right? So NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Somebody should give Jens Stoltenberg a lesson in geography. This is Pacific Ocean, not Atlantic Ocean, right? He doesn't know that. I mean, I'm serious. Jens Stoltenberg will go down as one of the stupidest man in history.
Yeah.
Right? So, but when he makes those kinds of provocative statements, you can either react strongly or you can ignore it. You can just say, this is just stupid.
What?
And so what I would say in the case of China, I would say to continue to show patience and fob off all these insults that are coming your way. Because if time is on your side, you can say, why don't we talk 10 years from now? Anyway, we as you all know, we live in extremely interesting times. Our world is changing fundamentally in a way that it hasn't changed in centuries. So we have to be psychologically ready for massive changes coming our way. But what makes it in some ways even more difficult to prepare for these changes is the fact that the civilization, and this is in response to your question about where's the West lost it, the civilization that led the world for the last 200 years is losing its way in a very profound way. And I say this because if there was one gift that Western civilization shared with the rest of humanity, it's what I call the gift of rationality. The West said, oh, we believe that in everything you do, you have to base it on evidence. You have to be reasonable and logical in whatever you do. And you must check and verify any information you have, right? In the search for objective truth. And yet, despite all these fundamental maxims of Western civilization, the West is acting irrationally at a time when it should be acting more rationally. And I'll give you 3 concrete examples, huge examples of irrationality. The first example, we know that the world has changed because it's become a small, interdependent world, right? We are hugely connected. And so to use a simple boat analogy, in the past when 8 billion people live in 193 separate countries, they were living on 193 separate boats, right? Separate from each other. So if one boat caught COVID, other boats wouldn't catch COVID. They're separated. But the world has shrunk. The 8 billion of us live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. So when one cabin catches COVID, all 193 cabins catch COVID. It's so obvious. Now, what happens if you're all living on the same boat? What's the most irrational thing you can do? The most irrational thing you can do is when your boat is sinking as a result of climate change, instead of trying to save the boat, you argue about whose cabin is more beautiful. There's an old expression, English expression, there's no point rearranging the deck chairs when the Titanic is going down. That's irrational. But that's what the West is doing. For the United States to launch its geopolitical contests against China when the planet is in peril, is hugely irresponsible and hugely irrational. And what's shocking is that the West has the leading universities, the leading think tanks, the leading media channels, and they don't point out that this is irrational behavior. That's just one example. The second example is that what's so obvious is that history has turned a fundamental corner this century. And what was the norm for the past 200 years is not going to be the norm in this century. So, for example, amazingly enough, 100 years ago, in 1924, a few Europeans could run the world effortlessly. 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indian ancestors of mine, just like that, effortlessly, right? Europe could run the world. But European power has diminished. One statistic. In the year 1980, the combined EU GDP was 10 times the size of China. 10 times. Now it's the same size as China. And by 2050, Europe will be half that of China. Now, when you have these massive shifts of power happening, surely you should look for rational ways and means of adjusting. Is that happening? It's not. Another sign of irrationality on their part. And the third sign of irrationality is this. If you had to decide what's the most important priority of any society, the most important priority for any society anywhere in the world should be to improve the well-being of its own population, right? If you had to make a choice between X and well-being, you say, no, I must take care of the well-being of your people, of my people. And yet, paradoxically, United States, which is the most rational society on planet Earth, at a time when the average standard of living of the bottom 50% of the American population has stagnated for 3 decades, and the priority should be to take care of the bottom 50%, instead of focusing on people, the United States says primacy is more important than people. Any country that chooses primacy over the well-being of its own people is making an irrational decision, and nobody questions it.